I mean, I have friends who ask me, well, isn't all of this just about a metaphor? That is that what Christianity is not really sacrifice. It's just a kind of metaphor of sacrifice. But the real sacrifice is happening in those temples where people are killing goats and cows. And in a certain sense, you could just say, well, it's always kind of a metaphor.
What do you know about the history of sacrifice? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Jonathan Sheehan for a conversation about just that, the history of sacrifice from the ancient and into the modern world. What are the deep roots of this system? How has it shaped governments and economies and hierarchies over time? And why couldn't the Christians seem to shake this thing that at times they seem to desperately want to rid themselves of? We're going to go over this and more. If you are interested in the legacy and the impact of sacrifice, this interview is for you. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and an exclusive bonus podcast, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. But for now, settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation all about the history of sacrifice. Dr. Sheehan, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk about your wonderful new book, On the Altar, A History of Sacrifice, From the Sacred to the Secular. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk about this work.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, this is a real opportunity and a real pleasure. Thanks.
It's great to have you, and on a topic that feels really large, right? This is a big thing to undertake for you. So can I start with a claim you make in the beginning of your book that is striking and I think gets to the point of the scope of this? You say, a history of Christian sacrifice is a history of history itself. So if we can start there, what do you mean when you say that? How were you using that to think about this project and the undertaking that you did in putting this out?
Well, I guess I'd have two ways to talk about that. I mean, one is the internal, particular to the story of the book, which is the way that for Christianity in particular, sacrifice has always stood as something which was, on the one hand, left behind, and on the other hand, somehow present. Something that needs a sort of legacy that needs to be managed and thought about. And in that sense, it has it represents, in a sense, Christianity's own history. So that when Christianity thinks about, or this is my reconstruction of this story, that there's a way in which the deep past, Christianity's own origins, are captured by this practice of sacrifice. In the same way that for the way that we think about history is not just things that happened in the past. It's things that happened in the past that still matter to us in some form or another. So all sorts of things happened in the past, and we don't remember them, and we don't care about them, and that's fine. They become historical in a sense when we start to care about them for whatever reason, either because some scholar brings them up, but usually because there's some pressing or urgent interest in whatever that piece of material of history is. And sacrifice has, in a way, for the long history of Christianity, been something which is, on the one hand, part of the, a sort of a founding, something that it left behind, the sacrificial world. The book has a lot about that, and I'd like to talk about that with you. And on the other hand, something which is obviously very present. It's present in every church across Christendom for 2,000 years after the death of Christ. So in that sense, it's a history of how Christians have thought about history. All right, so that's part one. Part two is, for me, this is a history of sacrifice. And from the beginning of this book, the problem for me was to try to figure out what's distinctive about writing a history. So sacrifice is one of the great topics of, it's a great topic of anthropology. It's a great topic of sociology. It's one of the founding topics of comparative religions. It's an enormous object of interest for the, broadly speaking, social and human sciences. And so how every culture seems to do it in some form or another. At least we've grown convinced of that over the last several centuries. So how do you take what might well be a kind of anthropological issue that is all human sacrifice and write a history about it?
Hmm.
And so the challenge of the book was to try to give sacrifice a particular story, to situate it inside of a particular tradition, and not to let the history become anthropology, so that I wouldn't, sort of start, so that I wouldn't feel obliged, for example, to have an anthropological theory of sacrifice going into this, but rather to look at the way that sacrifice sort of imminently from the bottom up plays, a foundational role in the Christian imagination more broadly,
I
at
think
different
some
times in
people,
different ways.
yeah, some people might be surprised to hear that this is a history of sacrifice in thinking on a Christian context rather than a theology of sacrifice where they
Yeah,
might expect this conversation to take place. So, why did you pick that path instead of the
yeah.
other?
Well, I think Christianity has the three sort of poles or legs to the stool of Christianity that are the sacrificial legs of Christianity. One is, broadly speaking, liturgical. So it's more about the practice of remembering, recalling, interacting, and engaging with the sacrifice of Christ in some form or another, in a setting
Hmm.
of some liturgical setting. Another is actually, I'd say, call it kind of communal, and that's the earliest sort of story of sacrifice, and it's the story of people's efforts to embody and imitate the actions of Christ, whether in the early cult of the martyrs, in fact, that's sort of where this all begins at some level, is not in the world of theology at all, in a kind of practice, political and communal practice, where it's not specified exactly what it means to reproduce or reenact the sacrifice of Christ, but people say they're doing it and feel like they're doing it and are motivated to do it, and they write about it, and it feels really important to the constitution of Christian communities in the beginning centuries of the church. And in a way, the theology, as we might see it, like the specific theology of the atonement, let's call it, is quite late. It's the last of these that develops, and a really robust and worked out effort to understand what it is that the sacrifice of Christ, the death of Christ, let's call it that, the death of Christ does theologically to enact certain kind of salvational, or kind of energize certain kind of salvational possibilities, is something which, is a medieval thing. So it's not, I don't think at the beginning actually a theological thing at all. I think it's much more in this communal liturgical world. And then theology gradually follows.
Theology comes in to start to take things over, as sometimes
Yeah,
it does. It's very wonderful though to reframe it as this historical approach, and as you're saying, like the legs here, because
yeah,
it brings a different lens into questions like why they didn't leave things behind. And on that
yeah,
note, can I ask about how you think of this shadow, but in order to get to that why they couldn't leave it behind,
yeah.
like the sacrificial shadow that they're dealing with and that we're still dealing with in order to begin to understand that historical origin. How do you frame that?
And by the shadow, do you mean the sort of the way in which it's sort of left behind but also present? Is that
Yeah,
the
because it, it
afterlife? Yeah,
it feels like the thing we think of sometimes as, oh, that's a thing from the text. And
yeah,
yet it is so present in so
yeah,
many different aspects, maybe not always in exactly the same way, but there's still
right,
these pieces of it.
yeah. Well, I mean, there's a way in which uh, sacrifice was, on the one hand, sort of negatively fundamental to early Christianity. I mean, it was kind of the thing that early Christians asked to participate in certain kinds of, basically Roman political practices, refused to do. And that's what marked you as belonging. It was a mark of belonging, that refusal, and which is why, in the context of conflicts with Roman imperial power, episodic as they might have been, maybe they weren't as continuous or as dramatic as early Christian apologists suggested they were, but they were certainly there, and it becomes a big part of the apologetic literature particularly from the third century onward. The sense in which one is willing not to, or is willing to suffer in some form or another in order not to sacrifice, in order to sacrifice yourself for not sacrificing on the altars of Rome, is negatively fundamental. So it's a thing that we recognize that we don't do this thing. And that's what sort of lets us imagine that we are part of this community. But on the other hand, right, the early Christians, as people listening to this show know probably better than most, were Jews. So it's not like the sacrifice was just a kind of Roman imposition. It was part of a deep religious imaginary and textual imaginary that comes through Hebrew Bible, and is part and parcel of the world of early Christians in ways that are, I think we're starting only at, I've listened to some of the episodes on your podcast, and it seems like we're recognizing this more and more. So there's these two heritages of sacrifices, one of which is sort of obviously sort of seen to be easy enough to reject, the other one much less easy to reject. And you can track some of this actually in the New Testament itself. I mean, the Gospels don't really talk about the sacrifice of Christ. There's almost no sacrificial language that's attached to Christ in the Gospels, but almost, by the end of the first century, the letter to the Hebrews, you've got a fairly robust sacrificial imaginary in place, in which a kind of characteristic move that Christians will make in order to manage this Hebrew past will come into play. And that move is to say, well, yes, Christ is a sacrifice, but it's the last one.
Right.
And it's the thing that finishes. It's the only real one. It's the thing that that ancient Israel was trying to accomplish with all of its complicated Deuteronomic temple regulations, but failed to accomplish. And now it's actually happened. It's worked. And now we can be done. But then that thing now that we're done, but now that thing that is the sacrifice of Christ itself becomes the center of liturgical life. And so that right around the same time in early liturgical texts, you find, again, a robustly sacrificial language, which is attached to the offerings made in church, made in these early Christian communities. Whatever one's theory of I know there's a lot of competing stories about how and when the Eucharist gets celebrated in these early communities, and I don't have really a dog in that fight. I'm not a late antique scholar the way that some people are on your show, but it's true that in the language of something like the Didache, which is, as I understand it, from the late first century, you're already seeing writers that will be folded into a Christian canon speaking in kind of robustly sacrificial terms about the actions of Christians in church. So this is the ambivalence, let's call it, of this inheritance.
Is that the process you see for how you describe them as both abolishing and absorbing sacrifice as a system? Does that feel like it's a smooth thing that gets worked out? Like there's a linear process where you can trace it, or it's moving in all different ways as different communities wrestle with this? Yes,
it's moving in all different ways as different communities wrestle with it. That's the nice way to put it. It really depends on where you are. So, it seems, at least from my understanding of the late antique literature, that the North African Christian context has a powerfully sort of sacrificial cult of the martyrs. Where they've done Christian archaeology and have dug up these effectively altars to the Christian special dead, with little places where you could put the bread and the wine, as you would do, for example, in a Roman rite of honoring the ancestors. And now this may not be uniform across the entirety of all of the different Christian communities, and I think that one of the things that we have to sort out, that we're still trying to sort out, as an early modernist, I feel quite worried about. Is just how plural the early Christian landscape was. So it's hard to generalize about what Christianity in the second century was, since it seems like it was different things to different people at different places. So it's not smooth, and it's often occasioned, I think, by external conflicts. So whether those conflicts are efforts of the Roman state, for example, to impose the sacrificial requirements as a condition of citizenship, which I believe happens with Diocletian at one point. It's a short-term thing; it lasts for only a couple of years, but does kind of catalyzes a lot of Christian energy to write about this particular topic. it's clear that any number of people are willing to conform. History tends to focus on people who don't conform, and the people the martyrs, but by and large, the martyrs are interesting and exceptional. So suggesting that most people don't. Most people are willing to sign the piece of paper that they need to sign in order to say, sure, I did some sacrificing. So I don't think it's by any means a smooth process. We can read the writings of Augustine, for example. Augustine gets quite upset at what he calls the crowds of banqueting drunks hanging around the graves of Cyprian, celebrating his birthday into heaven. His own mother went and sacrificed, left offerings at the tombs. This is something which split communities and families, I suspect, in fairly profound ways.
When we're talking about this plurality of communities here from different geographical regions, time periods, how are you seeing a purpose of sacrifice? Because I think in most people's minds, they may jump first to an idea they have from the Hebrew Bible of sacrifice, or an idea that comes from, Greek literature of what sacrifice does. But here, when we're talking about sacrifice at the graves of martyrs, are we in a very different space in your thinking of the purpose, or do we have a bigger misunderstanding of what purpose and sacrifice really is?
Well, you asked me a question in this that in our pre-circulated thing that I think would be maybe a way to start answering that question. So there's obviously structural ways to think about sacrifice. And I think there's actually a certain value in thinking about that. So like the suggestion, for example, that sacrifice has been particularly sociologically good at creating hierarchies is, I think, largely true. I mean, we can see it everywhere. I mean, sacrifice at its most fundamental level, sacrifice is something that is difficult. Like it's an action that doesn't come just as it requires a certain kind of special effort that distinguishes a sacrifice from some other sort of thing, any other kind of action we might take. And so the difficulty of sacrifice tends to create all sorts of possibilities of differentiation and opportunities for regulation. So you can think about special places. So sacrifice tends not to happen just any old place. It's not supposed to happen in the high places, for example, and it is supposed to happen in the tabernacle. And there's right away a kind of separation of a geography of I'll call it a geography of holiness, a geography of the sacred that's defined by places where you can and places where you can't sacrifice. And once you have a place then in the place, given the fact that you have to perform certain activities which are difficult, like you're not giving sand to the gods, you're giving something which is valuable or requires a certain effort to produce, then you need to supply that, just to supply the animals, for example, which requires certain amounts of difference between regular animals that can be sacrificed and other animals that cannot be sacrificed, priests to do the sacrificing. So there's a kind of, a process of iteration by which these hierarchies then get established and created and reinforce themselves. So I think that's probably worth observing around how sacrifice can do this in a way, no matter how you think about what it is, whether sacrifice is about sacrificing animals or if it's about sacrificing yourself. I mean, that is, these martyrs are not, they're the ones, you can't be a martyr simply by suffering a tiny little bit. You're not going to get a passion written about you for, the fact that you were deprived of, I don't know what, of your favorite goat. Or it's going to be if you're deprived of something which is fundamental to you. So there's certain difficulty there, then creates a value to the martyr that others won't have. And right there, you get a kind of differentiation, social differentiation, communal differentiation, and ultimately, I think, political differentiations that can grow out of kind of this understanding of sacrifice as something which requires a special kind of effort.
The structural undertones of
Yeah.
this whole system is something that feels like it can really flip that purpose question on its head when we may be coming with such an individualistic approach and thinking what this means, just for the individual, or what the
Right.
story of the martyr is for the martyr. But there is this
Yeah.
larger ecosystem, both economic, social, hierarchical, political, all
Yeah.
of this world that lives, which does feel like one of those places where turning to this as a history suddenly, makes your mind go, oh, those are questions I should be asking, instead of thinking of this as a theology. That
Yeah.
does feel like a nice and productive turn in the approach of this. As you did that, did it knock up any new questions for you in trying to look through those type of, hierarchical approaches of sacrifice that were unexpected for you?
Um, I might ask you to clarify the question a little bit.
I'm just thinking, like, it feels like one of those turns as you're going through those variant approaches that sacrifice brings into the world and the ways people come into it. Did it cause you to think about that question of the history of sacrifice and people's engagement of sacrifice in a different way?
So I came at this project from my earliest interest in the project at some level was, René Girard. So a writer like René Girard, who has a kind of view of sacrifice as an effort to manage what he calls mimetic violence. So the sense was, I was curious about this story that at the heart of sacrifice was killing. And it struck me as a peculiar idea, given the fact that we see so many different sacrificial cultures in which, yes, killing might be important to some of them, but to many sacrifices, things we might think of as sacrifices, don't seem to offer killing at all. They might be pouring out of wine on the ground, or burning of incense, or simply depriving oneself of something, like a tradition of monastic asceticism, which is often in Christianity absorbed into a certain kind of sacrificial imaginary. So it struck me that we got to, that the first order. So I didn't really know what then to bring to this this question of sacrifice, of whether what one should do is try to identify a different sort of common feature that all sacrifices share, or, and this is where eventually I think I went. So I think my first instinct was that, because I think that's the anthropological one, where you try to come up with, well, what's at the real heart of this anthropologically? And then I thought, well, or you could go the other way, and you could think, well, how have people described the world in sacrificial terms? Like, what sorts of things have been brought into an understanding and a concept of sacrifice? And if you proceed that way, kind of empirically, then I think it gives you first of all, it lets you see that sacrifice is something which is pretty hard to specify in sort of structural terms, because people do things with it. It's not something that's out there. It's something that people do and inhabit and make work to do different sorts of things. So you can get quite different. So in that sense, I think Christianity is no less sacrificial than ancient Israel, but it's certainly doing it in a way which doesn't look like sacrifice at all. Which is sort of doesn't look like sacrifice. I mean, to the extent, I have friends who ask me, well, isn't all of this just about a metaphor? That is that what Christianity is not really sacrifice. It's just a kind of metaphor of sacrifice. But the real sacrifice is happening in those temples where people are killing goats and cows. And in a certain sense, you could just say, well, it's always kind of a metaphor. I mean, people are killing goats and cows all over the world all the time. But most of those we don't call sacrifices. They're just things that we kill them and then we eat them. So when we want to call it a sacrifice, it's because it becomes an action that has a different meaning to us, not because the action itself is intrinsically different. And that's true of sacrifices all across the board. And in that sense, the concept I was using to think about this was broadly this sort of the sacrificial imagination. That is that it's a structure of yes, some of it's metaphors, but a lot of it becomes social practices these metaphors get socially, politically, and religiously enacted, so that you produce. I mean, just to give you a quick example, and then I'll stop blabbing. But the earliest churches, at least some of the earliest Christian churches, are founded on the cemeteries of martyrs, and so in that sense, and it becomes required by churches by the 4th and 5th century that altars to be consecrated churches need to have a martyr's relic in them at somewhere. So this produces an architecture that is connected to this particular history of the understanding of the way martyrs work as a kind of imitation of Christ. It produces different kinds of internal liturgical spaces. In the later Middle Ages, these martyrs, especially as Christianity expands over the Alps into the world of the Franks, the problem is figuring out where you're going to get martyrs' bones to consecrate churches. And so there's a very dynamic trade in stealing all martyrs' bones and then transporting them and selling them in kind of undercover markets to these new churches. So there's a so you start with a metaphor. Sure, the metaphor is it's an imitatio Christi, but by the time we're into the 7th and 8th century, this metaphor has become the foundation of an economy of criminal justice at some level, architecture, all over the place.
Which in some ways is very much like the beginning with the hierarchies and the structures that the old systems of sacrifice built around themselves. As you're talking about this, thinking of the martyrs' tombs and the connection there with the structures, you ask the question in your book, did Christians choose sacrifice or did sacrifice choose them? Can I ask you to say more about that? Because I think that relationship with the structures feels like one avenue, but there are so many. How are you thinking about that question now?
Well, I'm thinking about it in this way. So you could imagine a sort of hypothetical history in which Christianity managed to sort of not have the history that it did have, right? That is, it was a Christianity that wasn't worried about its Jewish past, that wasn't particularly worried about its relationship to the Greco-Roman sacrificial cultures that surrounded it, that was going to abandon the Hebrew Bible and just move on with a very tiny little canon of texts, maybe a set of Gospels, a kind of Gnostic version of Christianity. We might think of it that way, in which this sacrifice problem would no longer exist. But I mean, I think there's a million. So stipulating that hypothetical history is useful for me because you can see how hard it would have been to imagine that the kind of Gnostic suggestion of someone, I don't know, Valentinus or Marcion, who was saying, well, we should just get rid of all that Hebrew Bible stuff and just move on from here. And, it's a live option for some, but it's almost impossible to imagine historically how that could have happened. And in that sense, that's what I mean by sacrifice choosing them. That is, the people find themselves in the worlds that they live in. They find themselves in a world where they have to respond, let's say, to the Roman state, which says to you sacrifice or, some consequence. And you have to decide if you're going to do something or not. And if you decide you're going to refuse, then you need to justify why you're refusing. And then that produces the possibility of a new hierarchy inside the Christian community between those who refuse to conform, those who, go and do conform, those who pretend to conform and sign a piece of paper, so that Cyprian of Carthage has spent a good deal of time arguing about which one of these groups can be readmitted to Christian communion after the persecutions, and in fact the early church splits through kind of, you might think, the beginning of Donatism at some level, or at least what comes to be called Donatism, certain kinds of rigorous Christianity that exclude all of the people who failed the sacrifice test, is a consequence of this effort to sort out this Christian relationship to sacrifice. So it produces sort of fundamental structures in early Christianity. I mean, there are
Mhm.
other factors as well, but this is, and I don't want to claim for my book that I've identified the key to all mythologies for understanding Christian history, but I think I want to offer a kind of a sense of how important Christianity, sacrifice has been to the constitution of the Christian imagination, but also its kind of political and communal forms, and also a lot of its internal conflict and problems that it struggled with over, you know, I mean, the book is sort of ends in the 19th century, so I suppose it almost 2 millennia by then.
You've used this term a couple times, the sacrificial imagination. Can
Yeah,
I ask you, because you just mentioned imagination there again, and it's making me
yeah,
think, can I ask you to go back to that one to say how
yeah,
you are seeing that as a part of the framework in how
yeah.
you're understanding their arguments? And I think it also ties back to some of that, like the shadow of sacrifice, in ways that
Right.
that imagination is still living on
Yeah,
in what we're doing.
yeah, yeah. Well, so the language of the for me, the language of the imagination was really important, partly because the book wants to compass a lot of different things, from the built environment of early churches to martyrological texts, to normative theological texts, to kind of liturgical Eucharistic practices, and these are all things that were, I mean, they exist in textual descriptions, but they're not all what's brought, they're not all theoretical texts. Some of them are, they're just efforts to describe the world around themselves. And so I was looking for a way to capture a common space in which all of these different materials might be put into conversation. And that
Mhm.
space for me was the imagination. That is the way in which Christians have oriented themselves in some imaginative fashion to the sacrificial past. And it's true that I think that the structures of the imagination turned out to be more durable in a way than theologies. Actually, in some sense, Christian theologies of atonement happen in response to the Christian imagination. That it's Christian sense that at some point in liturgy, we're going to preserve the memory of Christ's sacrifice, and we're going to think that it does something for us. And the theologians, so that's happening in action, right? That's not
Mhm.
happening in normative text. And the theologians come along and say, well, we have to explain that. And one of
Right.
the reasons they have to explain that is some other theologian typically says, well, that's just malarkey. We shouldn't be thinking about sacrifice in those terms at all. In fact, Christians shouldn't be really, maybe Christ's sacrifice was one and done. We can remember it. This is what happens in the Reformation, but it's not alive in us in some form. And so that sort of demystifying approach to sacrifice, which some theologians will take, typically produces then a sort of re-enchantment, let's call it, or at least re-energizing of sacrifice in more positively normative theological terms. And so you get someone like Anselm, who will try to come up with a well worked out theory of the atonement in broad terms, but in the Middle Ages, in the 11th century. So the imagination lets me think about the ways that theology is in conversation with liturgy, is in
Mhm.
conversation with community and politics, and also to talk about the durability of this this durability of this problematic, let's put it that way, for over this long period that the book wants to cover.
And is that the space that gives sacrifice the room to expand, like the lived experiences and engagement with sacrifice that we see into, right? As you mentioned, the book goes past just the early church and early
Yeah.
martyrs. It goes
Yes.
much further. So as we're turning towards, you've mentioned Middle Ages, you mentioned the Reformation. Is that the space that gives the breath for this thing that is both left behind and present to continue to grow?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's right. So uh, one way to think of much of what we've been talking about is just the first chapter of the book. The 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 once one of the arguments of the book is that once the some of the brakes are taken off of Christianity, and by breaks, what I mean is the concern about whether or not it has successfully extracted itself from its kind of broadly speaking, Judeo-Gentile or Judeo-Roman surround, and by the and becomes sort of the monopolistic religion of empire and this book is really about the Latin Church. So I mean, I can't. It doesn't speak to what's happening in, broadly speaking, what later will be called Orthodox or Byzantine Christianity. So I just want the readers to know that there are limits to this story. But once the brakes are taken off, and that Christianity doesn't need to worry about its outside nearly so much, then it can be free to experiment with sacrifice in all sorts of ways. And so, broadly speaking, over the course of the Middle Ages, there's a deep history of kind of historiography on this sort of stuff, but over the course of the Middle Ages, the Latin Church becomes more and more robustly sacrificial. And this, you can see this in, so medieval historians often mark, for example, the millennium as a moment when a new vision of Christ comes into the world. A vision of Christ, which is in the Latin Church, no longer judge, but a suffering Savior. And the suffering of Christ's elevation of the suffering of Christ, and here I'm relying on other people's writings, has been connected to, the efforts to Christianize Northern Europeans, Christianize the Franks, and effectively accommodate Christianity to certain kinds of pagan imaginaries, let's call them new pagans, kind of northern non-Christians who they're trying to bring into the church. So you can see, for example, like Gregory the Great, that has these letters where he says, well, obviously we don't want to sacrifice rams and goats the way that these new converts like to do. On the other hand, he says, we do want to bring them into the church. So we don't want to be too aggressive with them, and we want to slowly sort of work their rituals and bring them over to understanding that the proper sacrifice is Christ's sacrifice and not the sacrifice. So there's a way in which these, in the context of conversion and mission, Christians will say, well, look, actually, we have this wonderful way that we can convert sacrificing peoples into Christianity. We just tell them that our sacrifice is a real sacrifice, and they can continue sacrificing. They just have to do it to the right person. Mm-hmm. So this is a way in which Christianity sacrifices, re-inhabits sacrifice now, not defensively, but more kind of projectively in a way to as part of their mission project. By the time you're into the early Middle Age, by the time you're into the post-millennium, so into the 10th and 11th century, then the sacrificing, we all know it, right? If you go to any museum of medieval art, you'll find these amazing crucifixes with Christ. The crucifix is bleeding all over the ground, and there's carved blood everywhere. When he's with the Arma Christi, and I mean the development of this thing that I found particularly fascinating in the book was the so-called Gregory Mass. I don't know if I have time to talk about the Gregory Mass.
Please, yes.
Well, Gregory the Great is sort of the first monk pope, and in one of the posthumous lives of Gregory, it's recorded that he is performing the Eucharist for the parish, and he declares that the body has become the bread has become the body of Christ, and somebody starts laughing in the audience, and he says, and he says, why are you laughing? And she says, well, how could that be? I baked that bread this morning. That can't be, the body of Christ. And he says, well, we have to see it with the eye of faith. And he kind of puts the Eucharist down on the altar. And I can't remember. I think he may cover it with the corporal, which is a special Eucharistic covering. And then he lifts it up, and it has turned into an actual little bloody finger, a little finger of Christ, as if to kind of make literal, and she's persuaded. This little story then becomes a robust kind of pictorial tradition that takes you from the say later Middle Ages well into the early modern period, the picturing the Eucharistic ceremony with Gregory often officiating, in which Christ jumps onto the altar. The dead Christ sort of appears on the altar, bleeding. So making clear that exactly the relationship between the body in the bread and the body of Christ itself. And this Gregory Mass I mean, it's a fantastic example of the way in which what started off as in this case, a theological argument about the real presence. So that's again an innovation of the 11th century, more or less. Then becomes a pictorial tradition that these would be displayed in churches. And so this is an example of this Christian imagination, the way in which it's much more literal than that doctrine of the atonement would be in theological terms, right?
Right.
But of course it is, because you have to picture it. You can't picture a symbol very well. So you give it a kind of literal presence. And so you get this robustly sacrificial Christianity in the pictorial tradition, and the sculptural tradition, artistic tradition that's, carries you right into the beginnings of the Reformation.
Can we jump right into there? Because I think if people are trying to think in this place, that might be the next time period they're imagining, and thinking that sacrifice and this pictorial depiction we're talking about here is a real flashpoint within this. How is that continuing in some ways the old tradition of this wrestling that we've been talking about the whole time?
Yeah. Well, so it is a continuing of it, but one of the things that is, one wants to be specific, sort of how does it continue it and why?
Yes.
So I think there's two reasons why the Reformation really begins to wrestle with sacrifice in a way that the later Middle Ages is not wrestling. And one of those simply has to do with the rediscovery of the patristic world. So the world that we've been describing in the first half of this discussion, the world of, the Didache, or the world of Cyprian, or of Augustine, the medievals definitely knew about this world, but they weren't interested in it. They thought it themselves as kind of continuous with it. And the texts themselves from that world were largely hidden in medieval libraries, often disaggregated from the other. So the patristic corpus is rediscovered in the context of the 15th century by for a whole variety of reasons, having to do, some of them with the relations between Eastern and Western churches, some of them having to do with the rise of humanism and the interest in old things more generally, and some of them having to do with efforts to theologically renovate a church which is seen as having lost its way. And this is even right on the dawn before the Reformation and into the Reformation, the sense that the patristics archive, as I call it in the book, will supply us with a proper version of what Christianity should have been, and should be again, is in a way integral to the Reformation, right? It's what the Reformation is about. We go back in history to discover what the church was, so that we can understand what the church should be. Now, in theory, so this explains a lot of things. So this explains, on the one hand, why the reformers. So when the reformers are 100% on board with this patristics project, because they need to know, they think, sola scriptura, right? The Bible alone. The Bible alone gives you only a little piece of what you actually want. And reformers were quick to realize that if they want to know what Christianity is, they have to know what the earliest Christians did and thought about the world that they lived in. So typically the first 4 or 5 centuries are seen as the normative period for Christianity by the early reformers. And they go to the patristic archive in order to find out what was going on. Now, the problem is, as we've already specified, that this early church was a gigantic mess. If you're looking for a clear and normative vision of exactly what you should do, you won't find that in the patristic archive. What you'll find is a set of very creative, argumentative, brilliant people writing about issues that they're interested in under circumstances that are sort of given to them. And so it turns out to be quite difficult to identify what a normative early Christianity is going to be. Now, when it comes to sacrifice, in particular, this is a problem, because these reformers, one of the first things they identify about, say, the late medieval church is that they think it's become much too sacrificial. And in that sense, they say, well, look, this church is actually not really a Christian church at all. It's a kind of Jewish church, or it's a pagan church, and they give you long histories for how this happened, explanations of how Christianity lost its way, either never properly Christianized in the first place, or at some point along the way it began to absorb the views of the Gentiles, or it converted too many Jews, and the Jews brought along with them their own prejudices and interest in sacrifice. Whatever your story, there's lots of different stories. What this produced was a robust criticism by both Lutheran reformers and Reformed reformers, Calvinist reformers, of Catholic Christianity, using sacrifice as the sort of the main target, the sacrificing priesthood, an overly sacrificial Eucharist, an overly committed cult of the saints, which is connected back to the early church and the history of the martyrs. So the first move that reformers make is to try to I'm not sure what the good word is, to clean the stink of sacrifice, as I think one of my authors say, from the church, and to do that by going back to those patristics to find out what the right version of sacrifice should be. This turns out not to be easy.
I mean, as we've said, it's so integrated in all of the imagination of those early writers and of the ongoing writers. You say, right, that the dilemma in your book, you say the dilemma will cut across the entire Reformation, that it persists. And you also mentioned in your book that you see the modern West, I guess, to bring us all the way to people listening now, as an actively anti-sacrificial community.
Yeah.
For that perspective, do you see the roots of that in coming out of the struggles of some of that Reformation thinking, emerging out of misunderstandings of the social systems and hierarchies of sacrifice, the change in perspectives? How do you come to that landing zone, given this broad history that you've walked us through today?
Well, I think that the modern West, as I kind of put it there, I think maybe dramatically, is ambivalent too. So on the one hand, we have a very, let's call it, robust commitment to the idea that we all should be interested in mostly ourselves. And that, a good person is a sort of profit maximizing person who acts in some fashion of following their own interests. And, the kind of modern individualism takes a lot of its utilitarianism, certainly consequentialist ethics, all sorts of things take their lead from that kind of sense in which the goal is to leave the sacrificial world behind in some form or another. That is to leave the sense in which what one ought to properly do is to give something away in order to be a kind of a virtuous person. On the other hand, and just my saying this out loud, I think indicates that this is only one side of the story, right? Because just as powerfully, one has a kind of commitment to the sense in which, we think that, the soldiers are doing something more important than us. There's something more noble about being a soldier than being a shopkeeper or a professor. That we have particular interest in and excitement about the ways in which people are willing to do hard things and suffer for their beliefs in various forms. It's the foundation of storytelling. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't want a long story about how people just. I'm reading Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks right now, and which is a story of a decline and fall of a kind of commercial family in 19th century Germany. If the story was simply how they went from one victory to another, I think no one would read the story. The story is how, the kind of their commercial ethics lead them eventually into a kind of pitfalls, and the family falls apart. And that is, so I don't think we've left sacrifice behind. And the book wants to explore what the relationship is between this, this kind of Christian world in which not leaving sacrifice behind is so foundational to the story of Christianity, and broadly speaking, the secular imagination. And I think they're related to one another. They're not identical to one another, but they're related. And there's a series of transformations that I think you need in order to get something like how we imagine sacrifice now, whether that is in theoretical terms, like the writings of anthropologists or sociologists, which is sort of one big landing point of this book to try to figure out why is it that early anthropology in the 19th century decides that sacrifice is one of those questions that we just have to answer. And I think it's overdetermined. I think there's in a way in which there are many reasons. It's hard to, a little bit like Christians didn't choose sacrifice chose them. The anthropologists didn't choose sacrifice chose them. I mean, if you want to know where you get anthropological data on ancient cultures, one place you get them is in the kind of collections of sacrificial stuff, descriptions of religions and customs and ceremonies and all these sorts of things that people begin to gather together in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries that then becomes the sort of material substrate to modern anthropology. Writers like Fraser, you name it, any number of these 19th century anthropologists are looking back at a kind of archive of biblical writings. So, the story it's not the same story. I don't think the secular imagination story, but I think there's a way in which we too, like Christians before us, we too, have a history that we inhabit. And, it's not like we can just decide that, we're going to leave it all behind. Any more than, Cyprian could have done that, or Augustine could have done that.
Well, as you said earlier, we basically touched chapter 1 for most of this. So if you have more questions, you're in luck because there's a great new book that you can go and get, On the Altar, A History of Sacrifice, From the Sacred to the Secular, that goes into more of these corners that we don't have time to cover all of today, but good news, go and pick it up. There will be a link down in the description. You can read through. Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk through this. I think it's a wonderful book. I'm really interested to see what the feedback to it is, the responses, because it is a unique and monumental undertaking. The span of time you put your arms around here is very fascinating in order to see this history. So thank you so much for the book and for coming to talk about it today.
I appreciate it. It was a real delight. It was wonderful to talk to you. You're my first podcast on this. So thanks again.
I'm glad to be the first over the line. Yeah. It is really a fascinating book. So I would highly recommend go and pick yourself up a copy, whether you're listening or watching, right? Link in the description. But be sure to also like and subscribe. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, we'll leave this there. Until next time.